Okay, so I am really excited for today's class. We have two of our city council members here, and so I will introduce each of them very briefly. To my farthest right, we have George Handley, who represents District 2. That's the district that I live in, so that's the area east of campus. George, is your district BYU campus as well? And then kind of, does it extend?
A little bit to the west, a little bit to the north, and then a good chunk of Joaquin.
Okay, so many of if you live south of campus.
Yeah, south and east,
you're in George's district. Okay. George was elected to the city council first in 2017 and then recently re-elected in 2021, correctly? I would note unopposed in 2021 because he's done such a great job as a member of the city council. George, when he's not a member of the city council, teaches here at BYU in the humanities department, and so I recommend his classes to you. To my right, immediate right, is Shannon Ellsworth, who represents District 3. And so District 3 is the kind of southeast side of Provo, extending to the kind of furthest south part of the city. Is that correct?
Yeah, the whole southern part of the city, and then it extends up to 820 North by 9th East. So if you live at Centennial or King Henry, that's in my district. And the mall is in my district, the Front Runner Station.
Okay, so when I first moved to Provo, I lived in that district, in a townhouse near the mall. Okay. And I really enjoyed it. I thought it was a really fun neighborhood to live in. So Shannon was elected to the city council in 2019 and has a long track record of working in municipal politics and being in a variety of volunteer positions throughout the city. And then when you're not a member of the city council, I don't know your official title, but you work for Rio Tinto, correct?
I work for Rio Tinto as the senior advisor of U.S. External Affairs.
There we go. Sorry, I
just
didn't
fine.
know
You're
the
just fine.
full title. So I'm really excited to hear from both of them. I have a lot of questions because I've kind of created my own private city council meeting. But if you have questions, you can also ask at the end. And so hopefully we'll have a really lively and fun discussion. So I'll turn it over to the two of you.
We can address your parking tickets at another time and date.
My parking people at the university.
Okay. Do you want to start?
You go first.
Okay. So we were asked to give like a 10-minute presentation each and then just take questions. And to avoid rambling and to kind of contain my thoughts, I modified a PowerPoint that I've used before. And it is always awkward for me to talk about myself, but here we are. So let's see. So in my experience, I have experience professionally working in government and politics. I once worked for the state of Utah for about a year, and that's the only time I've ever worked directly for government. And the bureaucracy was kind of a big headache, and it wasn't my style, and so I found that I really prefer the private sector. And in the private sector, I can use more of my skills and my natural abilities. And so I, in the past, have written a lot of plans, land use plans, environmental and natural resource plans. I've written a lot of policy, like 600 or 700 pages of public lands policy and natural resource policy in Utah, all from the private sector. And today, as was mentioned, I work for Rio Tinto, which is the world's second largest mining and minerals company. And there's a big mine in the southwest part of Salt Lake Valley called the Kennecott Mine, and I grew up in the town just next to there, South Jordan, and now I work there. And my role there is as the senior advisor of U.S. External Affairs, which just means I do government affairs, government relations. And so I work a lot with the communities that are impacted by the mine, that are adjacent to the mine. I work with South Jordan, West Jordan, Harriman, West Valley. Like the eastern half of the Ochre Mountains is privately owned by Rio Tinto. And so the land and the interaction between the communities and the mine and the uses, there's a concentrator, there's a smelter, there's a lot of water rights. All of that creates a lot of complexity. So I work with the cities and the counties and the state of Utah. And so during the legislative session, I was a full-time lobbyist at the Utah legislature. Some of the big issues that we work on have to do with land and private property rights, mining protections, water, air quality, business practices. The Utah legislature passed a bill that says no. It added a protected class. It added vaccination status as a protected class. And so in a job interview, you can't ask someone about like their gender or their race. Now in Utah, you can't ask them about their vaccination status. So if they have COVID, the COVID vaccine, if they have a malaria vaccine, you can't ask them about it, any vaccine. And that really is painful for businesses because they'd like the right to self-determine. And our corporation is so international that we do ask people about their vaccines when they get on a plane and they go to Mongolia or Australia or Chile or Argentina. And so part of my job there is also when an ambassador comes to Utah, when a consul general comes to Utah, and they often do. They're often lured here by BYU and the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I'm invited to these lunches that they have to talk with businesses in the state. And so it's been really rewarding to interface with the consul general or the deputy ambassador from Mongolia, the consul general from Australia, the consul general from Peru. Trying to think. I missed the one with Argentina and Chile. Who else has been here? Just, really interesting people I never thought I would ever have the chance to meet. And there I am speaking Spanish and visiting with them about lithium mines in Serbia and Chile. Moving on, I've done a lot of service on boards and commissions in the state and in the city, and that's kind of where I got my foot in the door. Not intentionally. I never aspired to be in politics. But when I moved to Provo, I think I was on the Governor's Rural Partnership Board. I was like 26. And then I knew Cliff Strachan, who was the former council executive director, because he used to work at the state when I worked at the state. And he basically appointed me to the West Side Planning Committee. And so that's how I learned how the sausage is made, because my undergrad is not in political science or anything adjacent to it. It's in environmental planning, and I didn't go to BYU, and that was like my first year in Provo, and so that's kind of where I got my hands dirty in Provo politics. Highly recommend to everyone applying and serving on boards and commissions, regardless of age, regardless of how long you think you'll be there. I mean, if you can commit to 2 years in a place, just put in an application or show interest to the council or mayor and get involved and learn about issues. I'm on the city council now. It's the only election I've ever run. I've also been involved with the Republican Party, and then the first campaign I ever ran that I was ever participated in was my own campaign, and I ran that. And did you guys hear Kate speak last week or a couple of weeks ago? Yeah, so Kate's a friend of mine, and when I was running, I just asked for free advice from everyone, Kate included. And then since then, I ran my sister's campaign. I think I have a slide on that. I ran my sister's campaign last year, and she has never worked professionally. She has an MPA from BYU and an undergrad in international relations. She has 6 kids, never worked outside of the home, and she won by a landslide. So I'm a pretty darn good campaign manager, if I do say so for myself. And then I'm also volunteering now with a school board campaign in Provo, because school boards have become highly politicized in the last 2 years, and I want to see good people there. So I probably have 3 more minutes, and then George will tell us about himself. Projects I've gotten to work on in my career: public lands policy, natural resource policy, private property rights, growth in Utah, land and real estate development. My role in government affairs is transitioning to a role doing land development. And then some of the local issues I've gotten to work on are housing, brew pubs, planning, environmental issues, Slate Canyon, Utah Lake. It never stops. There's 100 other issues, but these are some of the ones that come to mind. And then I always share this really important statement from Neil Maxwell anytime I talk to students or anyone. And I'll read it to you because it's absolutely critical. Some modest adventures of various kinds into the world of public service have helped me to see, too, that the shaping of choices in the political process is at least as important as choosing among the choices. In electoral ecology, there is a greater impact and influence at the front end of the process than in the voting booth, as sacred and special as the latter is. The voting booth is very democratic, but the shaping of the alternatives is aristocratic. It is work that is done by a few. I've been struck over and over again in my experiences with government and politics, modest as they are, by the Lord's counsel that honest, wise, and good individuals should be sought for diligently, and that such individuals we should observe to uphold. Neil Maxwell was a general authority as well as a political scientist, and I hope George talks about this because I just can't stress how much importance and emphasis we need to create around selecting good people to be on the ballot and fielding good people, fielding diverse people, fielding people who are fair-minded and hopefully not dogmatic and who are willing to examine issues from multiple lenses and get different perspectives. Who we put on the ballot is shaped by who was already elected. And so there's so much at stake when we're trying to field candidates for office. And so I hope you'll participate in those processes. And then there's so many headaches to be had in local government, but this is the quote that kind of keeps me going sometimes, and it's from Tolkien. It's also been quoted by Neil Maxwell and Elder Holland. But Tolkien said, "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till." I haven't been moving my... Oh, guys, I'm sorry. I've just been going through these slides without any... There we go. Okay, we'll come back to that one. I was moving the wrong slides. Let's start over. "It is not our part to master all the tides of the world, but to do what is in us for the succor of those years wherein we are set, uprooting the evil in the fields that we know, so that those who live after may have clean earth to till. What weather they shall have is not ours to rule." So in my, when I joined the council, I thought, oh, I can make such a big difference. I can change so many things. But in reality, I'm 14% of a legislative body. And so that's the impact I can have, is basically 14%. And I can only make these fields a little bit cleaner for those who come after me. But I'll go back to this slide. And that's the Neil Maxwell quote if you wanted to see it. So that's it.
Right. Well, I can guarantee that Shannon is more than 14%. She's one of those council members who exercises a lot of that influence that Elder Maxwell is talking about, and that's a lot of what we do, right? We're trying to shape choices. So she's a very valued voice on the council. So I'll be brief here. I'm the child of a political science major and an English major. My dad was poli-sci, went on to a law degree. My mom was English, and my brother and I became literature professors, even though my brother double majored in political science and English. I did not. I actually never thought of myself as very political, even though our conversations in my home, and I don't know, I sort of imagine that you're in political science for some similar reasons, but the conversations in my home were about culture, and my parents dragged me to the symphony and to the museums, but it was also always about politics. We were always talking about what was happening in the world, and I felt like our dinner table was my connection to the world, and it made me interested. And when I was in college, I remember my dad recommending that I subscribe to a newspaper so that I made it a habit to be reading a little bit about what was going on in the world. So my political evolution was very slow. I think actually I was an undergraduate at Stanford, where I think political conversation felt very charged, and it kind of intimidated me. So I didn't feel drawn to it, and I was very much drawn to the world of literature and foreign languages, and that felt like a safe place maybe for me. But of course, in the study of the humanities, you end up thinking about political issues all the time, and so it came back around. And since I'm at BYU, I guess it's okay to share this. I won't quote my patriarchal blessing to you, but I do have a pretty generic blessing. But there's one section of it that actually is very unusual, and it talks about the need for me to be involved in civic affairs. And I didn't know for the longest time what that meant, because I had no inclination, and it actually kind of so I thought maybe it was, a momentary blip in an otherwise inspired blessing or something like that. But when I started teaching in Flagstaff, Arizona at Northern Arizona University, and I got very, very excited about a new field that was developing called environmental humanities. And I never had made the connection between the study of the humanities and environment before, and I was a great lover of the natural world, and I became quite lit up and quite passionate about it. And so when I came to BYU and 3 years later, I immediately started getting involved in environmental activism of different kinds here in Utah. And that felt like where that, encouragement that I had in a very private way was playing itself out. I started to get invited to be on the boards of a variety of nonprofits, most of them about the environment, although I was on the Utah Humanities Board. I'm on the board of trustees at the Nature Conservancy. I helped found LDS Earth Stewardship and a variety of other organizations. And it was exciting. I got opportunities to meet with local and congressional leaders and lobby on behalf of different causes. I met people of other faith traditions here in Utah who were concerned about the environment, and they were excited that a Latter-day Saint cared. And at one point, I got on a city natural resources and sustainability committee that was created under Mayor Curtis, and I was a founding member of that board. And at one point, Mayor Curtis grabbed me one day and said, "You need to run for city council." And I was like, "No, I don't." And I told him no, and that was fine. And then a couple of years later, my council member stepped down, and the position was open, and he grabbed me again and said, "You need to do this." And I made a promise that I would at least think about it, and that was the mistake I made, because I also started talking to some friends, one of whom is Brigham Daniels, who's a law professor here at BYU, and of course he said, "I'll be your campaign manager, it's done, we're doing this." And off I went and got elected. And I resigned from all those organizations except for one. I'm still on the board of trustees at the Nature Conservancy, mostly out of just need to cut back and find the time to do the work on the council. But I've really, really enjoyed working on it. And I would just say, if I had to go back to my undergraduate career, I had no idea that city work was a thing that you could have a career in. I've met so many remarkable staff members in the city of Provo who do such interesting things, and they really make the city run, more so than elected officials in a lot of ways. We can shape the direction of it, but if it's not actually functioning well, our job gets incredibly hard. And they're planners and they're engineers and lawyers. My goodness, our city attorney Brian Jones is just amazing. We rely on him so much for so many things. So if I had known that there was a whole, I was so stupid that I just knew I liked literature, and then I realized that the only career I could have was to teach literature, and if I couldn't get a job teaching literature, I really, literally had no idea what I was going to do with my life, and I was embarrassed to discover that there were lots of things I could have done and I could have been interested in. Had I thought about them earlier. I don't regret my choices at all. I'm just only trying to suggest to you that you've got a lot of career options ahead. And local government is a beautiful place to be because one of the main reasons I ran was partly, there were two main reasons. One was I was really involved in all this environmental work, and I thought, boy, if you could shape policy on the city level about the natural environment that is the one that I interact with most directly, if I could help improve our trails and our parks and preserve our air quality, would this would be the best work I could do. But the other thing was I saw with the election in 2016, I felt like our national political discourse just fell into a sinkhole, and I'd never felt so much discouragement with the utter disrespect that was just commonplace, and the partisan people at each other's throats over party affiliation just seems so ugly to me. Even though I had my own political persuasions and orientation, I did not feel that defined me. It certainly didn't define me as a Latter-day Saint, and it didn't define me as a citizen. And so I just decided, city is one place where I can run for office, and I don't have to have an R or a D next to my name. I can just be me, and I can just roll up my sleeves and work with people of goodwill to solve problems that we care about. And that's largely been a really beautiful experience. So I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you so much. Okay, well, let's open it up to questions. By now it's very familiar. Go over to the microphone and ask away.
I'm just turning this on.
Well, you have to ask a question now.
One thing I should add is it usually surprises people when they find out that we're not full-time elected officials. And in Utah, it's like 99% of elected officials aren't full-time. And so on the council, there's 7 members, and there's 6 of us that have full-time jobs, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And so people are constantly surprised that this is not my full-time job. But George and I make like $20,000 a year doing this. So it's not going to pay the Provo City bills.
Yeah, so just a question. So you touched a little bit about why you got into the city council, but I was wondering what kind of motivated you, Shannon, to get into city council, and what made you kind of go from your career to like realizing that Provo was something that you wanted to kind of have an influence in?
Sure. Yeah, so I moved here when I was about 26, and I was almost immediately appointed to this board commission of citizens with a couple of city council members, and we're making policies for the west side of I-15 in Provo. It's called the west side, and there's some farmland out there, kind of different parcels and patches of 20 or 40 acres with some cows, and it's greenfield. It's greenfield development, so they're trying to figure out how it's going to grow and develop. And so I was in one of those meetings, and I have my background in land use, and I graduated from the College of Agriculture at Utah State University and in environmental planning, and so that's kind of the lens that I brought. But I was in that meeting, and one of the council members said, well, I took a straw poll in High Priest group, and this is what they said they want to do, so that's what I want to do. And I was pretty offended and angry and upset and shocked, and I was like, that just eliminated like most of the population in Provo, and so many people were not represented in that sample size, and I just wanted to turn the table over.
So she became a high priest.
And I've lived most of my life in Utah, part of my life in Arizona, in a very LDS like dominant area. So I'm very like, this is just kind of the air that I breathe. But the social structure, the religious structures don't necessarily incorporate, they shouldn't be incorporated into political decisions, in my opinion. And that definitely limits the ability of women and people of color and people who aren't members of my church to be part of a process that is indeed their process, a democratic process. And so I just got more involved, and it's funny, I ended up in the office of, this is what I did. I worked with mayors all over the state on policy and local developments and things like that. And I said, well, I've met all these mayors, I haven't met my own mayor, John Curtis. So I walk into his office, and there's these secretaries out front, and I say, I'd like to meet with the mayor. And they're like, oh, do you have an appointment? I was like, no. And they're like, well, you need to make an appointment. And so they made an appointment for me, and I come back a few weeks later, and I sit down with John Curtis, and he's waiting for like the shoe to drop, right? He's like waiting for me to be mad about something, because that's a lot of times why people come to the mayor's office. I just want to thank you for like sponsoring women and for doing a good job on Center Street and da-da-da-da-da. He's like, oh, wow, okay. And even when I made a comment about like his office, I'm like, these are nice couches. He's like, it wasn't paid for with taxpayer funds. And I'm like, it's fine. Like, oh, you're good. And so And so he's like, do you want to serve on the planning commission after he heard I was working on these West Side policies? And I was like, sure. He's like, do you want to go on a date with my nephew? And I was like, oh, I don't know about that. Different story, folks. But John Curtis
Awkward.
pulled me in. He pulled me in, and then he encouraged me to run. He was the first person to encourage me to run, and I'm like, oh, he's just blowing hot air, right? Like, whatever. And George encouraged me to run, and then I went to talk to Brigham Daniels, and he's like, you're a long shot, you're an underdog. And I'm like, for sure, but I'll work hard. And so for 2 years, I was here getting an MBA at BYU, and I was on the planning commission, and I saw how decisions were made, and I loved being on the planning commission. Really good people, and they don't really have a dog in the fight. There's no grandstanding. There's not a lot of politics, and so I was like, this is going to be great. Not that it's going to be great. I hoped that the council would have been more like the planning commission. But I didn't want to run for council. I just got more and more involved, and people encouraged me to run. And so I sat back and I said, I'll find someone good to run, like Neil Maxwell encourages. And I couldn't. We twisted arms. Everybody tries to, not everybody, but there's a kind of a core group that tries to twist arms and get good people to run, and we couldn't find anyone. I said, well, maybe somebody we don't know is great, and they'll run in my district. Well, I didn't like the two people who put their names forward. I not as individuals. I didn't know that I was going to be able to support their policies. So I ran, and I ran my campaign, and I crushed it in the primary. And Brigham Daniels was surprised, and then I crushed it in the general election with 65% of the vote. And Brigham Daniels says, you're not the underdog anymore. So hopefully that answers your question.
So as a student in the Valley, I mean, we hear, I don't want to get too much into this because I'm sure it dominates the conversation, but Utah Lake, especially maybe for George, but both of you, like as a student, we hear about it, events on campus, people talking about it, but what's the current state of things on that? And are there, residents who do want what the proposed plan is? What's that all about?
I've yet to talk to a resident who wants what is proposed. I don't.
You found one?
You found one? Okay.
Kate. I know one other lobbyist who wants it. Well,
Yeah.
no, actually, there's a lot of lobbyists who want it, but they're being paid.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure they're out there. This is clearly it's been driven for a long time by a group of developers who see tremendous financial opportunity in proposing something like this, and I think unfortunately back in 2018 was it when the first version of the bill was passed, the vast majority of the legislatures were kind of asleep at the wheel. They were seduced by the narrative that the lake is just a pit, and it's so polluted that there's nothing short of this kind of aggressive development idea to save it, which I think is completely false. And because
for those who don't know, can you give a
Yeah.
very brief overview of what this proposal is?
Yeah, so the proposal is basically says that, okay, Utah Lake is polluted. It falsely claims that Utah Lake is intended to be twice as deep as it is by nature, and that's not true. But their proposal is to dredge the entirety of the lake, which is their argument is the only way to sort of save it from its pollution, and then take the silt material that they dredge and build islands in the lake for as many, they've tried to walk this back, but as many as 500,000 people living in the middle of the lake. They thought it would be attractive to people if the islands were designed in the shape of the delicate arch, which
I can't not laugh.
was like turning the lake into a license plate. But it was something that the legislature thought might be the only way to save it, because it was argued that this would be sustaining financially, right? That there's no way that government could afford the billions of dollars it would take to dredge a lake of that size, and the only way to make it worthwhile would be to benefit financially from it, right? By building the islands. So anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail, but the bill basically created the sort of pathway toward which a developer could make a proposal that could get approved, and that the sovereignty of the lake bed would be given up by the state and given to the developers. When scientists here at BYU started to raise concerns about the feasibility of this project and the science that it was, the bad science that it was based on, a lot of the legislators who had supported the initial bill kind of acknowledged, yeah, it looks like we probably made a mistake with this bill, but there didn't seem to be the political will to actually repeal it. So what they did is they amended it, we hope, to a degree that it will make it almost impossible for this kind of a project to ever get approved. But the folks who are behind it are still pushing for it, even though it was a pretty significant defeat for them that the bill got amended. They were very opposed to it, and you may have seen billboards and other kinds of advertisements they were sending out surveys and so on. But so it's still a possible threat, right? I think one thing I've learned in being in political office is that probably the most important things you'll end up doing are just stopping crazy people from doing crazy things. And there aren't very many of them, but they are never gone. There's just always
the emails I send you about the crazy guy that wants to mine Rock Canyon.
Yeah.
The crazy guy that wants to build a mine at Provo Canyon, at the mouth of Provo
Right.
Canyon. The crazy people who want to build islands in the middle of the lake.
Yeah, it just crops up, and then you realize that you have to, and this goes to the heart of what Elder Maxwell's quote is about, you really have to rely on people to have enough common sense to fight those kinds of things. I mean, I'd like to spend my time doing other things rather than just fighting nonsense, but unfortunately, it's just the reality. There's some bad actors who want to do things that tend to be. I mean, I would characterize bad projects as ones that damage everybody else but themselves, right? It's sort of this very narrow focus that they end up having about what is the right thing to do, and it takes people in government to stop some of that from happening.
I'll just add on to that. In 2016, I was writing natural resource and public lands policy for Utah County, and so I wrote some policy about Utah Lake, and it wasn't on anybody's radar, but that's where I learned that the lake is on average 10 feet deep, and that's part of why it's a murky lake, and that's part of why it's a resilient, unique, one-of-a-kind lake. And then in 2018, they passed that goofy bill, and I remember talking to Brigham Daniels about this. We were driving to southern Utah doing a public lands field study, and we were like, somewhere between here and Lake Powell, and talking about Utah Lake, and we're like, how did that bill get through? Like, it just seems like a no-brainer. Why would you want to monetize and sell the lake? And I said, so help me, if they build those islands, I will chain myself to the lake bed. It was just very dramatic. But it's interesting because I've had my company is a very global company. I'm very conscientious about ethics and integrity, and I have to recuse myself on anything that would be a conflict of interest. And the only conflict of interest is Utah Lake, between Provo City Council and Rio Tinto. And Rio Tinto does not want the lake dredged. Rio Tinto has water rights that come out of Utah Lake, and they will be jeopardized by changing the bathymetry or geometry of the lake. And so I couldn't, even though I was aligned both at work and at the council, I really had to take a step back and bite my tongue. But working at the session this year, 9 out of 10 9 out of 10 lobbyists were working towards that end. We're working towards creating islands in Utah Lake. And anyway, so it's an interesting issue, and you can never. The thing about these things is they almost never die. I mean, eventually they die, but it's like we're going to be these bills. The Utah Lake Authority that now governs Utah Lake, it's that bill will be changed in the next session and the next session and the next session, and we're going to have to babysit it and watch it, and you just have to show up and do all this babysitting and monitoring and reading emails and contacting legislators, because little tiny decisions have huge impacts and they often go unmonitored.
Thank you so much for being here. So as someone who is also not a political science major, but I'm actually also kind of a STEM major, but really interested in politics, I'm really curious to hear about how your career path went from you getting your undergrad in a STEM kind of major and then transitioning into politics, and kind of how that process went, and then how you use kind of science and in your civic engagement as well, just more generally. So.
Is that for both of us?
Yes.
Okay.
Although it sounds like the first part's for you.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so my undergrad is in environmental planning from Utah State University, go Aggies. And the projects I've worked on in my career have been engineering projects, and engineering is funded by local governments. And the projects I've worked on in my career have been land development, and land is politicized. It has to go through a political process when you're changing the use, and development has to meet certain policy and government standards, because government is kind of the arbiter of health, safety, and welfare. And so I've always been government adjacent and government intersecting. And even when I was an undergrad, we would do projects for cities, and we'd go present to the city council, or we'd have an open house at public open house in Brigham City. We did a project for Brigham City, and then we did that open house. And what we kind of learned when we showed up at that public open house as like 20-year-old students was that it had just kind of been published broadly that the mayor had an affair, and then all these citizens came out and were mad at the mayor, but they were here at like our presentation. So we're like, it's not about us. And so my career has always been like tangential or intersecting with government and politics. And I worked for the state of Utah, and that's when I realized how much state policy impacts my life, which I had no concept of. My uncle was in the state legislature and was the majority whip, and I didn't know what he did. I didn't know where bills were made. I missed that day for Schoolhouse Rock or something. And but I just got a crash course along the way. And your question was like, how does STEM or science relate to politics?
Yeah, kind of how did you take your degree and use that? How did you get from there to here?
Yeah, okay. So I work for a mining company, and mining has to do with land and environmental issues 100%. And so that degree is still very relevant to every job I've had almost. And when I was working at the legislature this year as a lobbyist, there's plenty of people who have an undergrad in poli-sci and a JD. But there's plenty of people who are subject matter experts who come from an engineering background, and then they can lobby on behalf of engineering groups, engineering firms, engineering association, and infrastructure, and making solid infrastructure decisions, because most of the legislature are not experts in engineering or infrastructure. Very few legislators are experts in education, right? And that would just kind of be like my wildest dream if there were as many legislators who had been teachers as there are legislators who had been developers. And so we need lobbyists, we need diverse lobbyists, we need diverse legislators, because every background brings a unique set of kind of subject matter experience that not everyone, you can't be an expert on everything. And so it is great when you have somebody in like, with an environmental background who can kind of start guiding and leading out on environmental policies, or on education policies, or on engineering and infrastructure policies, or on whatever kind of policies. And so I just think that we need more diversity of experience in government, and I don't know, hopefully that answers your question.
And I can add something from a humanities point of view about science. I have used, I've taken advantage of the fact that I'm at a university and I know people who are in different scientific fields. I've just recently got a civil engineering professor appointed to our transportation mobility committee. I, during the pandemic, talked repeatedly with several public health professors. Utah Lake, I've consulted with a variety of professors. Going back in my career, even before I ran for office, there was a point at which I realized that I was relying a little bit on my science friends' authority rather than actually taking the time to read as much as I could, and especially with regard to climate change, I think I was just sort of borrowing from other people's knowledge, and I realized that wasn't going to be enough. This was, like I say, before I even ran, and I just made a commitment that I would try to be scientifically literate whenever I could be about anything that I cared about. So I have audited a botany class. I'm learning birding right now. I read widely in science because I love it, and I ask my science friends all the time what to read because I feel like it's super, super valuable. But I've also felt like it's been really helpful to the political process to have scientists who have the courage to want to loan their expertise. I don't know what you thought of what happened in 2020 during the pandemic, but the summer of 2020, the rates of infection had died way down. Of course, the vaccine wasn't available yet, and as the summer was coming to a close, we were contemplating the arrival of 70,000 students from all over the country for BYU and UVU in the Provo-Orem area, and our conversations with public health specialists here at the university, they were in a panic. They said, you guys need to do something, and so I felt like we have this problem in our society. I don't know if you've noticed, but people don't bother to be scientifically literate about a lot of things, right? And so there were a lot of nonsensical ideas out there about masks and about the pandemic, as there are about all kinds of controversial issues. And it was really important for us to get really good, reliable information, peer-reviewed research to be able to present to our community. I had a doctor from the Intermountain Health who spoke, who's our only epidemiologist here in Utah Valley, speaking about infections and so on to help inform us about those sorts of things. So, anyway, that's just been incredibly helpful. So even if a scientist doesn't get directly involved in politics, I hope that scientists will always be both valued by society enough to be invited to speak, and that they'll be trusted and heard when they do, because it's a real shame that they get so easily dismissed these days. It's one thing that's very disconcerting.
And I'll just kind of re-emphasize what I said before, but we need diverse experiences in government. And George has obviously a wealth of knowledge in the humanities and is a very skilled writer. And all the time I'm like, oh, let's just have George write it. Oh, George can write a statement. Oh, George will write the vision statement. Oh, George will do it. So
I do like that, actually. I enjoy
like
that.
it?
Well, I enjoy knowing that my humanities skills are useful for something.
There's so much writing. There's so much speaking.
Yeah,
there's so
I do.
much thought and
It's
logic.
true.
But if there are more questions, it'd be great to hear from a woman. I'm just ready to get women involved in government, everyone.
I'm really curious as to the dynamics of people with full-time jobs in part-time government positions. Just how do you, not that I'm like skeptical necessarily, but just like how do you prevent conflict of interest? Like, do you have to like qualify for certain things, or are there, like you mentioned that you had to like excuse yourself from certain discussions, like how does that work with you all having full-time positions in different areas?
I can quickly say, BYU made me sign an agreement before I was allowed to run that would essentially said I wouldn't. It wasn't so much conflict of interest as it was conflict of commitment to my job, right? I could not. They wouldn't agree to let me run for office if I was going to, bail out on my responsibilities on campus in any way. And if there was any conflict of interest, obviously they would expect me to avoid that. I haven't faced that. There've been a couple of moments where it's a little weird, where I don't know which hat I'm sometimes wearing, because I represent BYU and I'm a faculty member here. And I know some people, when I was running, thought that meant that I was going to do BYU's bidding wherever I went, and there's been none of that. But I do think that so that hasn't been terribly hard. One thing that I have benefited from is that I have, as a professor, I have a relatively flexible schedule. And so I have an e-bike, so I can dash from campus to city and back in no time at all. And I do have to go often during the day. I also am an empty nester parent. I don't have kids at home. I don't have to go to soccer practices and plays and music performances anymore.
You
so
don't get to go to soccer
I don't get to go.
practice
Those
and music
no,
performances
honest,
and-
yeah. But my point is that I can, I'm working from 7 in the morning until 10 at night, but what I'm doing at any given hour could be BYU, it could be city. It's not a set schedule, so I'm able to juggle it anyway. It's very challenging, though. It's very, very challenging to balance life, work, and city service.
It's definitely like this time management conundrum, and especially in Provo, because Provo's a big city for Utah. So if you're not from Utah and you're like, Provo's a small town, it sure is comparatively, but it's a big city in Utah, and the top 5 biggest cities in the state, maybe the top 10, put in a lot of time. A lot is expected, right? And so my sister, we have that one. So my sister is on the city council in a town that has 10,000 people, and there's no airport, and they don't have a sewer district, right? We have our own sewer. They don't have their own water. They're part of a broader regional water network. They don't have their own power board. We have our own power company, right? And so most of these things in her city of Woods Cross are really outsourced, and then she's kind of working sometimes on budgets and sometimes on land use and sometimes on beautification or whatever. But Provo's a big city, and we have a lot going on, and it's very dynamic. In terms of conflicts of interest, my corporation is very global. I don't think there's a more global corporation in Utah, and it has this very strict ethical. And there's a whole department focused to ethics, and so my boss had to make so many cases and make so many arguments when he was hiring me that that we could manage conflicts of interest, right? And so I had to disclose my conflicts of interest. I donated to a candidate who's running for U.S. Senate, and I disclosed that, and I had to disclose any projected conflict of interest. And then my boss said, she won't work on it, I'll work on it, and she's not going to work on it, I'll work on it. And I think the company would have preferred if I hadn't worked on Utah Lake at all as a city councilor. However, I don't know that it is ethical in other ways to ask an elected official to not represent their constituents in some way, which is sometimes asked of people who are in elected office and have some real or perceived conflict of interest. And I made arguments as a city councilor on behalf of Utah Lake, and I was accused of representing my organization. And that was really hurtful, coming from someone who sort of knows me. And I actually used George as an example. I'm like, do you always assume that George is working for BYU? Then I hope you'll give me the benefit of the doubt.
Yeah,
and it's certainly not easy to manage. It's not easy to manage people's perceptions, and you can't. But you know how you're going to be able to sleep at night. And I took an ethics course when I was here at BYU, and I think about it often, and I think about the fact that we can't stop thinking about ethics, and we can't stop evaluating and reminding ourselves of the commitments that we have, and we can't just assume, oh, I'm a good person, I have a temple recommend, I'm honest with my fellow man and woman. There's more to it than that, and you really have to you really have to examine multiple issues multiple times and be conscientious about it. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
I would just say BYU's been so staunchly neutral, almost to the point where it's harder for me now to talk to BYU officials than it was before I was elected. So when I have a chance, when I get asked that question specifically about BYU, I would say I point to that. It's actually BYU's very, very careful about ever looking like they're trying to tell the city to do anything. And in fact, historically, they over the previous 10 or 15 years, they became so aloof from the city that it was a problem. They're working very hard now to create more of a relationship with the city. What'd you say?
Nothing.
Under your
Nothing.
breath?
I didn't say anything.
She's an Aggie, Anyway, so it's been better, but there's never been a moment where I've felt like BYU's trying to get me to do something, and and I'm not comfortable with it, or vice versa. So.
But I think most professions have to deal with that in some capacity, especially if you're involved in politics. Like a friend of ours is an administrator here at BYU, and he encouraged me to run as a friend, as a citizen, and I said, hey, will you endorse me? He said, nope, I can't. I can't put a sign in my yard. I can't do this. I can't do that. So everyone has different constraints and needs to evaluate like what loyalties and duties they need to honor.
I will say it's not uncommon for people to assume, just because we tend to assume politicians are corrupt, it's not uncommon for people to assume that some other interest is motivating me when I'm pursuing something, and believe in something or support something. There's people want to dig and say, what's the real motive going on here? And,
The Provo City Council has a long storied history of people maybe doing things for their own self-interest.
But I don't think that history is as long or storied as the Utah legislature.
Oh, no. Yeah.
Shots fired.
Yeah.
But
and I would only say I've only been in office 6 years, or 4 years, not even, what am I saying? And so I've had 3 councils that I've been a part of. And, I've had strong differences of opinion with various counselors, but I've never.
There's
I
one
know who you're
person you
thinking
should
of.
have in
But
mind,
I've
yes.
never seen. I've
It's
never
one.
seen
One.
anything. I've never seen any dishonesty. I've never seen any hint of. I'm not saying it can't happen. I'm not naive, but I do think Provo's currently got a good situation. There are good people in office. We're all flawed, but I think we're a good bunch.
George talked about when the students were coming back in 2020, and that's kind of the impetus or the motivation for us to consider a mask mandate, and we passed a mask mandate. And people were, I don't know that I've ever gotten that much email about anything combined as we did the mask mandate. And somebody was putting on Facebook that we were bought off, and I'm like, who's buying us off? The mask manufacturers, the Etsy Sewers Guild of Mask Sewers. Like, who is sending you checks, and why haven't I gotten mine?
I know.
Like, is this 3M? Is this BD? Who is the mask check writer?
Well, on that, we'll conclude. Thank you so much.
Thanks.